What's up, everybody? David Parsons here. This is Nostalgia Trap. Hope you are doing well wherever you might be, despite the world being increasingly covered in poisonous clouds and me feeling more and more the way maybe dinosaurs might have felt in their final moments. But despite that, we're heading towards an election in November. And in my life, at least, and I don't know if it's been true for you, but presidential elections have just become increasingly insulting every 4 years. I mean, they've always been insulting, but I mean, the idea of like Donald Trump and Mike Pence versus Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I mean, who gives a fuck? Honestly, it's insane to think that politics is a choice between those two people. So I'm not even going to be the podcast that's gaming out who might win and who might lose and what might happen and are we going to the Supreme Court and all that kind of shit. It just drives me nuts, honestly, and I'm sure I speak for a lot of people out there. So if you're looking for gamed out election stuff, there are certainly other podcasts to listen to. What I want to do this fall is talk about culture, talk about where we're at. That's why Justin Rogers Cooper and I have been doing shows about Los Angeles as the sort of center of American empire in the years after World War II, and we've been thinking a lot about the presence of actual Nazis in America and that sort of thing. So, that's going to continue this week and going to continue for the foreseeable future in terms of trying to take a look at the bigger picture. I mean, that's pretty much what Nostalgia Trap has been about all along anyway. But today we have Danny Bessner, a favorite of Trap, a favorite of the Trap community, and certainly a favorite of mine. I love talking to Danny, and he'll be back a lot, I think, in the coming weeks as we talk about movies, specifically movies about and in and taking place in Los Angeles. So again, developing this idea as LA as sort of a central and key place for understanding American political, social, and economic and cultural reality in the years after World War II. The film we're looking at today is called Falling Down. Came out in 1993, starring Michael Douglas, directed by Joel Schumacher. I won't go into it a lot here because we spend a long time talking about this film. Danny started texting me about this film a couple weeks ago with a really compelling set of ideas around what makes this film such a complicated lens on the early 90s, on trends around race and class, and particularly thinking about this transitional moment of the United States not having a sort of imperial direction in the 90s. The film, I was young when it came out. I had no idea what it was about and kind of, I think, got sucked into it, the film as a sort of like pop vigilante film. But as I've gotten older, as we've studied American history, if I thought about a lot of the things we think about on this show, Falling Down emerges as a really important and complex picture. And so this episode is me and Danny sort of taking it scene by scene and figuring out what makes this movie tick and why it's such an important lens for understanding the politics of the Trump moment in 2020. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. And like I said, we're going to have a lot more conversation with Danny Bessner because he's, to me, a voice that always brings a really critical set of perspectives, and he just knows a ton about this stuff. So we have a really great, fun time talking about Falling Down. I hope you stick around to the end. And like I said, we're going to have a lot more Danny Bessner episodes on LA movies coming in the future. So if you want to get in on that, subscribe on our Patreon. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap is where we're putting up a lot of bonus material and where I feel like the people who are into the show can get further into some of the ideas and context that we're dealing with there. So thanks to all the people who are supporting the show. Thanks to Danny Bessner for being such a great sport with these conversations. And I hope you enjoy this. Here's my talk with Danny Bessner about Falling Down. Okay, Danny B, good to see you. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. I'm in beautiful San Diego, California. There are no fires here. I'm in one of the most soulless Airbnbs I've ever been in my entire life. The shower door was literally off. When we entered, I turned the shower nozzle fell off. So it's really just been a great day. It really, it put me in the mind of falling down. I'm currently an aggrieved white man ready to talk about the world has really come together to make me feel insecure and unwanted.
Yeah, it's hard for us white males, Danny, and you know what? It's been a long road for us, and it's a long hard road. And you know what? I thought the oppression of white males started in 2016, but apparently it started years before, because we see this incredible depiction of the alienated, tossed out, obsolete white male in this movie Falling Down that I've been dying to talk to you about. And I know we've been texting back and forth, and both of us have recently viewed the film. Just to get the facts quickly out of the way, Falling Down is a film that stars Michael Douglas, directed by Joel Schumacher. Schumacher is a well-known filmmaker. He actually just died, I think, a couple months ago. Probably one of the, I think, most prominent gay filmmakers in Hollywood, honestly, throughout the 90s and 2000s. He's an important figure for a number of reasons. He made a lot of weird films, including Batman and Robin, that people are like to make fun of. But either way, Falling Down is an interesting film, and it came out in '93. It has a particular history because it was shot during the LA riots, and it's a movie that I remember seeing maybe on video in the '90s a ton of times. It was a popular movie, I think, but watching it now is freaky, right?
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing it a ton in the 90s. I think it was on television a lot, if I recall correctly,
Yeah.
which is surprising given I mean, there's a lot of vicious, racist homophobia in the movie. It's something that I mean, I don't think could be made today. I don't think a movie like this would be able to be green lighted, whatever the phrase might be. But I don't think it could be made today. But it's just funny how in 20, 25 years, so much of the culture has changed that this was considered something that could be a popcorn movie. I think in our text you described it in a very interesting way. It's like a vigilante popcorn movie, and I'm sure we'll talk about that now. But I remember seeing it a lot during the 1990s. I remember definitely sympathizing with the Michael Douglas character, at least in parts. Recognizing that he was kind of a psychopath, but also, cheering when he killed the Nazi or whatever it may be. And we'll talk about that. I think it's a very important movie to understanding a lot of the currents of the early 1990s and the LA in the 1990s. And I think it's interesting. It's really, I believe, lasted. I posted about doing this episode on Twitter, and I posted some things that emerged from it. And it's interesting that everyone seems to have some sort of relationship to this movie.
Yeah.
Particularly, I mean, this wasn't a scientific study, but particularly like white men of my age, our age, really are familiar with this movie. And so it's lasted. It's a cultural product that's lasted, and it's interesting to think about why.
I agree. And reading about it and seeing people's different reactions to it is really interesting. People have baggage around this film. And have I feel like a lot of people saw it in the '90s and then sort of had an opinion formed about it, and they kind of haven't returned to it. So returning to it was really kind of crazy to me because you're right. It's taking the vigilante film, which we've seen in a lot of different examples of over the years, including all the way, I would say, up to last year's Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, as a sort of playing on these themes of alienated white men and a kind of vigilante thing. But this film is intervening on that discourse in the 90s in a very like big budget Hollywood way. You mentioned like a popcorn movie. This was presented as sort of like a fun movie, like an entertaining movie. And I definitely remember people cheering at different points in the movie and it being associated with this sort of larger cultural conversation about multiculturalism. And there's this incredible Newsweek article that I just sent you, Danny, dude, the whole thing is fucking nuts. Like the entire article is really, like, to me, the fact that we've been sitting here talking about, since 2016, the Trump males, the sort of like, even like the Jordan Petersons, the people who are wringing their hands about the death of Western civilization and all that shit. Like that discourse was there in the 90s big time. And I mean, now I'm thinking like Rush Limbaugh was part of that discourse. Yet I don't really think of this as a Republican film, right? Like, it doesn't seem like a conservative film.
No, it's a liberal film. I think actually very clearly a liberal film. And I think just before we get into it, I think it's important to just highlight some antecedents. And you're more of a film historian than I am. But to me, this is very much sort of in the lineage of Taxi Driver or Death Wish or Dirty Harry. I feel like those are the three big antecedents to this film, sort of the angry white man who society has pushed down and who's going to fight on behalf of justice in a meaningful way. And I think that the film is a bit confused, and we could talk about that. But I just wanted to ask a question before we get going. Are you familiar with any other sort of antecedents to the white man vigilante film, or is this really a 70s phenomenon, the 70s, early 80s, sort of war on crime phenomenon? I just don't know, because it seems like very influenced by that trilogy that I just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it has a kind of flavor to it that I think that emerges out of the 60s for sure, because part of it is like, responding to a sort of, white male paranoia. Speaking of the Newsweek article, of a diversifying America, and I think that's part of it. And so you get films like, I'm thinking about like Straw Dogs, Dustin Hoffman film. I mean, there's a lot of like sort of playing with white male rage and violence. That's you could trace that stuff all the way back to film noir. I think I ended up watching like, I don't know, probably a dozen Columbia noir films in the last couple of months because they were on Criterion. And there's a lot of wrestling with kind of this post-war male, especially like a guy that was in the war that doesn't really know what to do with himself. And he's getting into crime, and and so in other words, it's not really the clean up the streets guy that you're referring to, the guy that's more sort of like upset with the sort of late 20th century. So yeah, I mean, and like I mentioned Joker, but even Joker is literally a film that is, it takes place in 1983, and it's supposed to be about deindustrializing New York City and the sort of like, Ford to city, go to hell moment. It's supposed to be about that. So I don't know. I feel like this film is playing with, Bernie Getz type stuff. I mean, the kind of, I know Joker has basically an exact kind of reenactment of the Bernie Getz shooting, although they replaced the black kids with Wall Street brokers in Joker. But there's some of that too, and I feel like this film is definitely in that genre. But at the same time, you mentioned it's politics, and it's sort of like what it wants to say about all this stuff is confused in part because it's a film that's trying to entertain us, and it seems like a film that's sort of like split between a million different impulses. It's not. In other words, that might lead to why there's so many different interpretations of it, because it's a film that is kind of muddled the message, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think it's absolutely muddled, and I want to talk about it in 1 second. But I do think it's important that you mentioned sort of the people coming home from war. If I'm correct, De Niro's character in Taxi Driver was a Vietnam veteran, or at least he dressed right. Yeah. It's implied.
Yeah.
And so I think Defense, obviously, we'll talk about this more, but a quote unquote veteran of the declining defense industry, which Defense should have just held on for a few more years because he would have been right back in a job. But I think that this is interesting, and I think it's muddled because I think it's a muddled political moment. And I think that sort of the post-Cold War, post-LA riots, pre-Bosnia, pre-9/11 moment is a moment where the United States as a whole, and sort of the white male as the incarnation of the ruling power structure of the United States, doesn't know what to do, right? And I think this is very clear in sort of the mixed racial imaging in this movie, and the mixed racial imaginary, where you have quote unquote gangbangers who Michael Douglas attacks at one point. Well, I don't want to get into details. We'll go scene by scene. Who attacks at some point, but then again, at the end of the movie, it's a young black kid who really helps him learn how to shoot the bazooka, and who Michael Douglas, actually, his character William Defense Foster, protects or like grabs.
Yeah.
Closed off. So I mean, it's very just mixed and muddled in a lot of different ways, which I think is just indicative of the moment.
That's a really funny scene for showing exactly how muddled this is, because it's like in that scene that you referenced with the bazooka, which was like trailer ready shot. Douglas's character is sort of talking to this. He's frustrated that there's a construction site going on, right? Like he's frustrated that there's road work going on that's blocking his way in the city, and he talks to this construction worker who basically tells him to take a hike. And I was thinking like this working class construction worker that they're portraying here is really lame, and like it's not clear what they're trying to communicate in that moment. But other moments are more building on, I don't know, interactions you can have in Los Angeles. So maybe we can go through the sort of episodic nature of this film. It begins with a guy in traffic, right? And I mean, it seems like that's a very common sort of LA idea, right? Is that the traffic is eventually going to drive you nuts.
So I think that the traffic scene is actually really important for a diversity of reasons. One, it's sort of obviously it's actually a really well shot scene and sort of brings you immediately into the tone of the movie, sort of this frantic heat wave. His air conditioning isn't working, and the whole movie, I think it's important to emphasize, has sort of an orange tint to it.
Yes.
And that is definitely by design. It reminded me actually a lot of Do the Right Thing.
Yes.
Another heat wave movie.
Totally.
Which sort of has yeah, exactly, and sort of has that orange tint to it as well. But I also think it's really important to think about this as sort of the failure of the project of the post-war period, and I think it gets right into that theme immediately, because this is like the famous highway system of the post-war period. America as the sort of city of cars, and particularly LA as the city of cars, right? And this, of course, is a big theme in LA Confidential and Roger Rabbit, and a lot of other LA movies that were produced in the 1980s and 1990s, which is sort of the construction of modern LA. And this was a city built around cars. So I think right away in the very first scene, you get the failure of this post-war dream.
That's perfect. I love that because the traffic is the infrastructure not working, and it's something that's associated very, very tightly with LA, but it's also, tied up with that. I love the Cold War history of building those highways. I think that's what the 1956 is the Interstate Highway Act, somewhere in there.
Yeah, it's in the mid-50s.
Yeah,
55 or 56. But I think it's also very important because if I recall correctly, the interstate highway system was actually justified as a military innovation.
Right.
Because the idea was that you needed to have these roads throughout every area of the country so that you'd be able to move troops and to move population should the Soviet Union attack the United States with nuclear weapons. Right. So it's very much tied to this Cold War imaginary, very much tied to the United States as being a nation of cars. Right. But so right away, the movie gets you into it's like this has failed. Right. This is a totally failed project. And now people are literally not moving at all.
And it's infrastructural failure. Yeah.
And
its infrastructural failure is a social failure in that scene too, right? It's like everyone is in these hot cars, sweating, and you feel you're very much inside that car with him, feeling the sweat, feeling the fly, feeling the sense of like deep alienation while sitting on a hot freeway with millions of other people.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, then there's like the visual image that is defense, right? Do you want to talk about that, or should I? Should I get into that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's an intensely relatable scene in terms of traffic, right? I mean, I think that's part of what makes this movie work for people and why it was in part popular is because right away it's setting this tone of like these kind of everyday sort of humiliations of being a working person. And part of that, I think, was really what drew people to the movie was that sense of I've felt that way too. But in terms of his look, yeah, Michael Douglas looks like a 50s or late 50s or early 60s, defense contractor type dude. He's wearing a short sleeve shirt with a tie. He's got a briefcase with an apple and a banana sandwich in it, and he's got a crew cut and a sort of Malcolm X style 1950s glasses. And I think, Douglas, was someone who spoke about that. I know I sent you a chunk of an interview where he was saying, that's how he thought of the character. He thought of the character as someone who was a little bit out of time. And maybe you can speak on that because it's a little bit, I think it's an important element of the film is that this character who's going to walk through 90s LA is representing this sort of white male of a different era who's like, I don't know, he's walking around in a daze and he doesn't seem to really understand what's happened to his city and country.
Right. The way that I was thinking about it as I watched the movie is it's really a portrayal of the organization man without an organization.
Beautiful.
And so I think Yeah, so I think that what the movie is really arguing is that the United States was supposed to be built for this person, right? This sort of, they say he's in his late 30s. He does not look like in his late 30s. He's 40. He was 46, I believe you said at the
Hmm.
time of filming. And the idea is that the sort of post-war United States was built for this person. Sort of the white average American would be able to have a home and would be able to have a happy family, and sort of like the WASP elite. And I think the WASPness and not just the whiteness is particularly important because if you'll remember, they keep on referring to the fact 2 or 3 times that Defense's ex-wife is Italian.
Mm.
And so I think it's also important to emphasize that his name is like William Foster and not, let's say, Stu Goldberg or, or James Gandolfini, just the name that
Right.
just,
Yeah.
he's very much a WASP person. And so I think the movie right away gets you in the moment is that this is who the United States was built for, but the United States is no longer working for this person. And then this raises big questions about whether the United States is actually working for anyone else. And I think we'll address as we go through the movie. But I think it's probably one of the best first scenes I think in any movie. I don't think I'm exaggerating that. It gets you immediately into the story. It lets you know exactly who you're going to focus on, and it gives you the tone right away and sort of the aggrievedness of the entire movie. And I think it's important because also basically what happens is his car breaks down, and then a cop, sort of California Highway Patrol, I believe, comes by, and then they had to move his car out of the way, and it just sets the tone that everybody in this movie is a raging asshole. It really, female characters for the most part. We could talk about that, but it very much actually reminded me of Seinfeld, where like everyone is just like they're most aggressive at all moments.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's sort of the tone of this movie. Like everyone is like extremely aggressive at all times, and I think that's a really critical thing to emphasize.
It would be interesting to put this film actually next to Speed, because I feel like Speed is a film that also like kind of plays with these like kind of LA stereotypes, whether they be ethnic or racial stereotypes, gender stereotypes, or just LA stereotypes of how people behave. But it's also one of these orangey kind of films. It's also, it takes place in this like, I feel like the LA films of the early 90s had a very similar kind of look. Maybe they were all using the same cinematographers. But it's a really slick movie. And I think that's part of what is weird about this movie is because it's a slick film that's really about complicated stuff like political economy, race, and class, and really what you're identifying is this sort of long arc of the 20th century of the WASP male who is sort of dealing with some sort of larger crisis, and that has to do with race and class and things like that. And I thought that maybe we could get to that first scene in the Korean grocery store, because it's so fucked up. And like, to me, it's like, just to give like a wider history, like there was like pushback from this film, right? Like people.
David, just very quickly.
Yeah.
David, just quickly. Why don't we just tell everyone like what happens in the scene?
Yeah.
So very quickly, we cut to Robert Duvall, who's the other main male character. He's a cop on his last day at work. He's in the same traffic jam, but he's like smiling and happy. And he's like, the as you described in a text to me, the cucked cop. And we'll talk about that later. So anyway, he basically reaches a breaking point. He takes his keys, he takes his briefcase, and he just leaves. He just literally leaves his car, gets out of the traffic jam. His car has to be pushed by the aforementioned cop and some random other guy who's also an asshole. And Robert Duvall comes to help, and the cop is an asshole to him because he doesn't know he's a cop. But even when the California Highway Patrolman discovers that Robert Duvall's a cop, he's still an asshole, and they move the car out of the way. And then I believe we cut to Defense in the Korean store. Okay, David, please.
Yeah, so he goes. So this, I feel like this scene was common in the early '90s, and that's part of why this was, I think, touched a really hot issue in LA, because the idea of particularly the Korean grocer, played a role, like an iconic role and a kind of a reactionary one, actually, and kind of thinking about the LA riots. But also, you mentioned Do the Right Thing, right? Like there's a movie that plays with these interactions between different types of people, particularly in these sort of like Asian American owned bodegas and liquor stores that tend to be in working class areas. So Defense goes in this story. All he wants is change, and he wants to get change so he can use the payphone
to call his ex-wife. So this is important. This is like the motivation.
Yeah.
It's Defense's daughter's birthday, and he wants to go visit his wife who lives in Venice Beach, California. As Robert Duvall says later, of course, an Italian would choose to live in Venice, a very strange line. But that sort of highlighted the waspiness. So he goes to a payphone. He doesn't have enough, or he called once, they didn't pick up. He doesn't have enough change because he wants to talk to his wife about attending his daughter's birthday party, his ex-wife, and he goes into the Korean store to ask for change.
Yeah, and the Korean store owner is kind of antagonistic. Says, no change. You have to buy something in order to get change, and this sets him off. And I mean, what ultimately happens in the scene is Michael Douglas's character takes a baseball bat from the Korean store owner. And ends up smashing the store up, but he smashes it up in a very particular way. He goes around and says everything is too expensive. He's mad that the Coke costs 85 cents and he can't get 50 cents to use the phone. That was the whole point of the transaction. So this is the moment in the film where the frustration that Michael Douglas's character is feeling in that opening scene begins to turn into a kind of violent rage, or at least it's starting to become violent, and he crushes all this stuff. And it's about just to real quick. The point of the scene is he ends up smashing the store, saying everything should be cheaper, each item should be cheaper, and ultimately he purchases the Coca-Cola, terrifies this guy, and takes his 50 cents. So what confounds the police afterwards is that he didn't steal from him. He instead, made like a political statement basically by smashing the store up and saying that everything is too expensive.
He says two critical things. So the first thing he says when the Korean store owner angers him is, "Do you know how much money my country has given your country?" Right. So first he thinks he's Chinese. And the guy says, "No, I'm Korean." And he goes, "You're Korean. Do you know how much money my country has given your country?" Right. Which is a comment on American imperialism, right? Which is that the country of Korea, the Republic of Korea, should be grateful to someone like Defense, not only white man, the instantiation of America, but literally a defense worker for quote unquote protecting Korea for the duration of the Cold War. So that's one thing. The first thing that he says, so there's this imperial behavior.
And he doesn't know how much money. The guy says, "How much money have you given Korea?" And Michael Douglas is like, "I don't know. It's got to be a lot though," which is hilarious because it's like he doesn't even know.
And then he says, "It's my rights as a consumer," or something along those lines, like something like very Ralph Nader 60s, like, "It's my right as a consumer to be treated fairly." And he goes, like you said, he goes through the store and he asks him, "How much does a bag of donuts cost?" And the guy's like, $3.50, and he's like, "Too much," and he smashes it. Right. So he does pay for the Coca-Cola at the end, but he only pays him the price that he thinks it should cost, which I believe is 50 cents. Right. So he doesn't pay the full price. He pays the price that he thinks this thing should cost. And it's a total commentary on sort of this country leaving this guy behind, right? And sort of this vague imperialistic masculine sense that this Korean store owner should be grateful to someone like Michael Douglas, Defense for protecting quote unquote his country. So right there, I think the two themes of the movie are directly linked.
Yeah.
Which is this sort of imperial nostalgia in this post-Cold War moment. Of course, the Cold War ends between 89 and 91, and Defense, of course, I think it's important to emphasize, is a laid-off defense worker.
Yep.
He worked for a made-up company. He said they discovered Norco. He'd been laid off for a month because there actually was a contraction in military spending immediately after the end of the Cold War. And so this is sort of what's going on here. And I think those two themes, sort of this consumerist, political economic theme and this imperial theme, are emphasized right away.
Yeah. And he even says, and I'm sure you caught it, he says, we're taking the prices back to 1965. I mean, it's explicit in the scene that we want to go back in time to a previous era. And I love the connection between imperialism and the prices of consumer items in a bodega, right? And all of that being sort of expressed through the object of the Asian-owned store, that this white guy is sitting there kind of thinking like, what do we fight our wars for? And it's gonna come back. That theme of war is gonna come back throughout the movie. But the next scene in the film is takes place in a really very famous, and I would even say cinematically famous area of Los Angeles, which is the Angels Flight Hill, which is really famous for a number of reasons. Partly because it's Bunker Hill and it's the destruction of Bunker Hill, and it's basically it's a story of gentrification in the 20th century in Los Angeles. But it's also,
could you tell that story, David?
Yeah.
Could you tell that story very quickly?
Yeah. So Bunker Hill is, I mean, this story is told in a really amazing way in Mike Davis's City of Quartz, but it's also featured, if you want to watch the documentary Los Angeles Plays Itself. They talk a lot about Bunker Hill as a place where the working class lived, and there was a vibrant city where Bunker Hill is, and the best place you can see it is this film made by a UCLA graduate student named Kent McKenzie, made a film called The Exiles, which I think came out in 1961 or 1962. It was an independent film. It wasn't like a big Hollywood release or anything. But that film, The Exiles, was shot in Bunker Hill, and it was shot with a group of young Native Americans who were the exiles. They were exiles from the reservation living in Los Angeles trying to make it. And it's an extraordinary film for a number of reasons, but probably the most extraordinary part of it is our ability to see this Los Angeles that doesn't exist anymore. This place that connected a working class neighborhood of single family houses. That then this Angel's Flight, which is Angel's Flight is a train that goes. There's a name for it, but a train that goes up a hill. And it's just one short train that goes up a very, very steep hill. And Angel's Flight, that going down Angel's Flight from Bunker Hill left you in an area of the city that was vibrant. There were bars and restaurants and places where people were hanging out, and you see that in the film in an extraordinary way. But what happened is, those places were targeted for gentrification. The way that the documentary puts it, they say that at a certain point, in the 1960s, those places are targeted in part because they're thinking these places are right next to downtown. I mean, it's like, you're basically in downtown LA, and it was almost all poor people of color living there. So they ripped those out, and they ultimately replaced them with big with big skyscrapers, and that became part of a different project in Los Angeles, and it's one that's a really deep and dark history. So in this scene in Falling Down, he walks up that hill. He walks up Angel's Flight Hill, and Robert Duvall actually makes reference to it later in the film. He says, "Oh, that's Angel's Flight Hill. That's a shithole. That place has been a shithole for years." And the hill that he ends up sitting on is like he's sitting on this rock in a field covered in graffiti, and he gets accosted. This is in Falling Down. Defense gets accosted by I guess what would be called a couple of homeboys, a couple of gangbangers in the 90s Hollywood language. Those characters are probably the most kind of lame stereotypical characters to me in the film. I don't know what you thought of them.
Right? It's a Latino gang. It's It's very clearly not black, right? The two characters are Latino.
Yes.
I believe, right?
Yep.
Right. So that's also very important. So this is the moment of Dangerous Minds, 187 soon thereafter. So there's a whole genre of basically Latino gangs, and so this is of course very much on the mind of early LA with sort of carjacking and gang culture. And I believe, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe later in the film they refer to the Bunker Hill area as gangland.
Yeah.
Right. So this is very clearly commenting on sort of the early 90s LA obsession with gangs. Right. And what happens is really interesting because these two guys come up to these two quote unquote gangbangers come up to Michael Douglas and they're like, "What the fuck are you doing here?" And he's like, "You know what? I understand why you're mad at me. You don't want me in your home. I wouldn't want you in my home, in my backyard." Right. So he's like, "Why don't we just agree that I'll just sit here for a second and then I'll move on. Right. I'll go away." And then he tries to leave, and then they stop him. They're like, "You're going to have to pay a toll, right, to get out of here." And this is when essentially the first instance of person to person violence that we see. In the first one, he doesn't actually hit the Korean store owner. He destroys his property, but he doesn't hit the store owner. And this is the first time when Michael Douglas actually essentially beats these two guys up, or at least beats them away with a baseball bat. So I think it's important to just emphasize that the structure of the film is kind of interesting. It's basically a series of sketches that progressively get more and more and more violent.
That's
right?
part of what that's part of what I think they actually played up in the trailer. I mentioned the bazooka, but it's part of the kind of I think interest that's drawn in the film is through the idea that this guy is sort of collecting weapons. And you know, he starts with a baseball bat, and then, you know, in the next scenes he's gonna eventually get a gym bag full of like automatic weapons, which is hilarious. The idea that like these guys, these gangbangers have a car full of like just filled with automatic weapons, a gigantic gym bag, which is then going to be his thing. What's funny to me about all of it is that the film never falls into like too much of like feeling like this guy, like there's not a lot of cues that you should think that defense is cool. You know, there's not a lot of like cool, like Rage Against the Machine music playing when he grabs the gun. It's instead like, it's a little more matter of fact. And I feel like that's part of what allows the film to be read in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, no, it's very much matter of fact. And this is, I think I agree, this is probably one of the lamest scenes in the movie. It's that these characters have absolutely no depth whatsoever. There's like not even a political message going on. And I think like this is what it seems like this that let the movie be viewed as just solely a sort of racist portrayal of white male aggrievement, right? Because this is definitely a scene where I could like imagine, you know, white guys in the mid '90s like cheering, right?
Oh, 100%. And I have memories of that, and that figure. I mean, in part because I'm from a town that is basically the demographics are white or Hispanic. The discourse here among white people was super racist about you know, quote unquote Mexicans and gangbangers and stuff like that. So I felt that scene definitely allowed a kind of Bernie Getz release for, cause it is the most Bernie Getz type scene because these guys are, you know, criminals. The other people he kind of encounters in the film aren't necessarily criminal, but this one, these are. So there's like almost like that thing that Matt Chrisman mentioned on our show when he was on a while back, where he said that, you know, there's like this, you know, you need the justification of the violence, and once you have it, that like allows you to like really enjoy the sadistic elements of it. And I feel like that scene of all the scenes in the movie plays with that a little bit, because he shoots the guy in the leg, and he's kind of, there's a little bit of element of sadistic torture there, and it definitely allows, I think, people to watch it and get a sort of fascist pleasure out of it.
I think that's right. But this is why the movie is so muddled. That's 100% right. And that's the way 99.9% of people are going to read it. But it's also critical that it's at Bunker Hill, right? Because this is an area that was totally destroyed, which leads to people of certain communities turning to like crime, right?
Yeah.
So this is why it's muddled, right? There's also an element of being like, there are structural reasons why the characters are assaulting Michael Douglas, but sort of the overt message is white guy beats up two Latino guys.
And the Latino guys shoot a bunch of innocent other Latinos too. They make a point of that, and the camera sort of lingers on all the victims of the gang violence, and they're all people, like it's like a woman in a stroller, it's an old man, like they kind of show the collateral damage, and I felt like that was somewhat an attempt to sort of make a little bit of a comment on what's going on in this neighborhood.
Right. So why don't we move on to the next scene?
What else happens in this movie? I mean, there. I don't know if we can do every single scene. I think there are a couple really key ones, though. I'm looking at a sort of what happens next. I mean, there are a couple after he gets with the homies and gets their guns. That's part of what happens in this film, is this sort of parallel story with Robert Duvall, right? And maybe we can talk a little bit about that story of what's going on, because it seems like, I mean, do you think they're paralleling? I mean, like Robert Duvall's relationship with his wife and defense, they're kind of, they're a little bit of the same guy. Like, I feel like that's why Robert Duvall's character is in the film, is he's going to maybe recognize what's going on. Is that right?
Yeah, I think he's a little, they're very clearly juxtaposed, and the juxtaposition is a little bit inscrutable to me, because Robert Duvall is basically actually from the generation that Michael Douglas's character is dressed as. Right, he's probably someone who became an LA cop in the late 60s, early 70s. Right. He's retiring in the early 90s. He has a good relationship with his wife, though he's emasculated by his wife, who constantly yells at him. He's moving to Lake Havasu, Arizona, and they keep on mentioning London Bridge. And this is actually a theme at some point. Actually, I think in the scene after the gangbanger scene, the next time we come back to Michael Douglas, he purchases a snow globe with a unicorn and a quote-unquote Indian on top that plays the London Bridge scene. So I think this is actually a subtle commentary on sort of imperial decline, because they mention very specifically and very strangely that London Bridge was taken apart brick by brick and brought to Lake Havasu, Arizona. And I think it's sort of it's indicating, I think, sort of a British imperial decline and sort of obliquely commenting on, so what does the American empire do after it no longer has a logic, right? And as we know from 2020, it'll very soon come up with the logic, first preventing genocide and then 9/11 fighting quote unquote jihadist terrorists. But this is a moment where it's unclear what the American empire is going to do. And I think there's a reason that the movie keeps on referencing sort of this London Bridge, sort of these past glories
totally
that are no longer even in the United States. And so I think it's important that we have this ex-cop, or this guy who's about to be an ex-cop, moving to where London Bridge is. I think it's an important commentary on it. But it's a bit unclear to me, like the exact comparisons that they're making between the Robert Duvall character and the Michael Douglas character, because Robert Duvall is cucked, right? Like he's constantly yelled at, he's put upon at the police department. Everyone's constantly insulting him. Like literally his boss says he doesn't like him.
Yeah, and he belongs behind a desk, not on the street.
Right. So and then Michael Douglas is very much like a masculine character, sort of seizing life by the balls and doing whatever he wants. So but Robert Duvall is nominally the hero and Michael Douglas is nominally the villain. Of course, at the end, he questions himself from the bad guy ? And I think that's unclear. But it's a bit of, again, like a lot of this movie, the message is a bit muddled.
Yeah, I think you hit on something I think that's really important about that muddled message is it's a muddled moment, especially when you think about like sort of the geopolitical elements and economic elements that the film is playing with. The early 90s are a fucked up transitional moment, right? It's the end of the Cold War, and the United States doesn't have a clear purpose in the world. It's pre 9/11, and it's pre. I mean, you haven't even mentioned Bosnia, but even Bosnia, I felt like was something that wasn't 9/11 in Iraq, in the same way of like getting the public engaged in it. But yeah, the scenes that I'm remembering now is that he encounters you go through these episodes in the film of like you're almost invited to identify with Defense's sort of alienation and frustration with other people. And a couple like there's a panhandler that's like a white guy that comes up to him and says like, oh, give me some money. And Michael Douglas tells him to get a job, basically. And the guy says,
wait, can we pause on that for a second?
Yeah.
So I think that's actually the next scene. Michael Douglas is walking around and a panhandler comes up to him eating a sandwich. And he's like, give me money. I need to get back to Santa Barbara. I can't get back to Santa Barbara. And Michael Douglas says, where's your driver's license? He says, I don't have it. Michael Douglas says, so you drove from Santa Barbara without a driver's license? He comes up with some excuse. And then he's like, I haven't eaten. And he's literally eating, right? So the idea is that that like everyone is put upon the sort of middle class white man. Like even the poor are sort of lying to the middle class white man to sort of get what they want.
Yeah, the lazy and this guy is lying, and he tells him, come on, man, you treat a vet that way. I was in Vietnam, and he says, what were you, 10 years old? And he says, no, I mean the Gulf. And it's like it's totally catching exactly what you're hitting on here, which is that throughout this film we get sort of intimations that there is a history to the United States and a history that's sort of over, but we can sort of like grab parts of it and try to like kind of try to kind of like capitalize off those old glories, but it doesn't even work anymore. And the guy's just lying. He's like, oh, I was in Nam, I mean the Gulf, and like it's almost like we're watching as those past glories are sort of losing their currency and falling apart.
And David, I think it's so critical because in that scene, Michael Douglas is standing in front of two posters like that are like, I believe they're like very hyper colored in sort of a neon-esque color. I think one says like world peace and one says world war, something along those lines, right? So very clear, like sort of emphasizing these imperial moments. And there's, I mean, as we'll talk about in a minute, I'm sure when we get to the Nazi guy, I mean, there's militaristic imagery and militaristic references throughout the entire film.
Yeah.
It's like very, very clearly a commentary on American empire in a post-Cold War moment. And it's interesting, it's almost never talked about in that way. And I think that's a failure. I do think Schumacher failed in that way, right? I think like too easy to read the film as just as white male aggrieved, as sort of the angry white male, and that is there. And I don't mean it's too easy in that people who read it that way are wrong. I mean, I think that's the overt message. But when you see it a few times, you see it's very clearly a comment on American militarism. And so what do you do when the veteran doesn't have anything to do anymore? What do you do at the end of history, right? Who's left behind by the end of history? I think the ultimate question of the movie. So there's that scene, and is the next scene? Is it the next scene is the bank scene, right? With the black guy standing in front of the bank. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, at some point, yeah, you see that. But I think before that, you see the fast food restaurant scene, the whammy burger scene, which is another scene that I feel like is playing with the sort of like inviting the average American to sort of identify with the frustration of going to a fast food place and the person behind the counter tells you you can't get what you want. And in this case, he's 3 minutes late for breakfast. He wants breakfast. It's 11:30. The girl behind the cash register says, we don't serve breakfast. It's over. And so he talks to the manager. And it's again another scene in which consumerism is kind of the language of a lot of the Cold War stuff you're talking about. It's kind of like he has a sense of entitlement, in part because he feels that he deserves this, and he ends up, speaking of Nader, he invokes the phrase "the customer is always right." In order to get what he wants, and when he doesn't, and the manager tells him he can't have breakfast, that's when he pulls out his guns. And again, he's a guy who's not. In the film, it's interesting because it's played not as I'm going to shoot everyone here and get what I want. It's instead like just a person who's just like, he actually apologizes and is like, I'm only resorting to this violence because I want things to be the way they used to be. It almost sounds like the person that's like, I just want it to be normal again in America 2020. And that desperation is drawing them to take a gun out, right?
And I think what is so crucial about this scene to me is that it's very subtle, and I may be wrong, but the woman who plays the sort of fast food worker is a very pretty young woman named in the movie named Sheila, right? He actually says, "Why am I calling you like Sheila? I don't even know you." And she's like, "You could call me Mrs. Goldfarb," or something along those lines. But if you notice over the course of the scene, the actress plays it as almost getting turned on by Michael Douglas' sheer masculinity, right? She definitely like the way she looks at him is at the very least one of admiration, and at the very most literally sexual attraction.
Yeah, I think you're right. She's contrasted.
Important, I think, to emphasize.
Sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No worries. I mean, just very quickly, I think that there's a virility to Michael Douglas's character. Yes. Like over the course of the movie, he gets more and more virile. And I think this is the scene where you really see that this young pretty worker is literally like turned on by him.
And he's contrasted with the manager, right? Who's like kind of this dickless manager standing next to her. When he comes out, you're kind of like she's looking at the manager as this sort of like, nebbishy idiot. And Michael Douglas looks like power. I think that's part of it.
Right, which is also very interesting. And we'll talk about it more when we get to the Nazi period. But of course, Michael Douglas is a Jew, and so there's all these complexities to what's going on. But so after and also we should just say there's not that much to say about it. But throughout all of these scenes, like the cops are like they're finding more and more out about him. Like there's all these like disconnected incidents, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And there's not much there, except I think it's important to mention that the sort of confusion on race that this movie has is that the police officers are like basically like hyper multi-culty. Mm-hmm. They're like all multicultural. There's like a black woman, a Latino guy, a white guy. Robert Duvall's ex-partner is a Latina woman. And so it's interesting because there's this like very 90s, like this sort of like multi-ethnic, multicultural police force. And then these like very sort of retrograde views on race, even though, as we'll talk about now, I think after the whammy burger scene, it's when he goes to the bank and it's the economically viable scene, right? So yeah, Dave, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so there's watching the film last night, I was like, holy shit, I forgot about this moment. And like, again, this movie is a fucked up, weird movie, but it layers in things that you have to think that there were people making this movie that knew what they were doing and knew sort of what direction they were trying to push the audience in order to consider some of these issues. And this scene was striking to me because the scene is a black dude, I think, who's dressed similarly to Defense. He's wearing like a shirt and tie.
Exactly.
And
the exact outfit.
Yeah, and he's got a picket sign. He's standing outside the bank, and he's got a picket sign. His picket sign says "not economically viable," which I feel like that could be the title of this episode as well. But either way, he's yelling at the bank and he's saying, "I'm not economically viable. That's what I was told when I tried to take out a loan. I wonder why that is." And he's making the very clear assertion that this bank is discriminating against black people. I mean, we don't have to go into the whole Mike Davis history. I know Mike Davis isn't the only person who's written about this shit, but like Los Angeles and banks and real estate and loans, I mean, that's a very, very particular expression of redlining and the phenomenon that was nationwide in the middle of the century. But the housing discrimination and banking discrimination in Los Angeles is really the story of Los Angeles in a lot of ways, right? So, defense, I love this scene because defense is staring at this guy, and what happens is the police come and they arrest this guy, they throw him in the car, and as he's leaving, he locks eyes with defense and says, "Don't forget me." And there's kind of a solemn nod from defense that he seems to understand what's going on here. I thought that was you want to throw some analysis on that, Danny? Because that's a really rich scene.
This is the key to the movie, and this is what's interesting, and where I think it's more than just an aggrieved white man. So the character, the black guy who's standing in front of the bank, he says there are two important things. One, he's dressed not just like exactly like defense. He's in a short sleeve white shirt, a black tie, and pants. So there's the clear visual. These are the same person, but more importantly, almost, is in the scene before defense says, "I worked for this company for 7.5 years and they fire me." And it's very subtle. I had to actually put on closed captioning. But when you're introduced to the black guy standing in front of the bank, he says, "I have banked at this bank for 7 years and they won't give me a loan." So I think that crucial number is 7, lucky number 7. It's ironic, but not only are they dressed exactly the same, but they have the same exact number of years institutional relationships with these two institutions, his defense contractor, and this guy with his bank. And they're both not being respected, right? But I think it's very important that they chose to have a black actor play this character, right? Because they're saying subtly here, but I think very clearly, that this is a problem that transcends race. That even though its defense aggrieved white male masculinity is definitely 100% the sort of main story of this movie, the scene is so important because they're saying it's a larger American problem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That also black Americans who are being let down by the American state, who are being racially discriminated against, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's why this scene is so critical, because also later on in the movie, the guy protesting the bank has a sign that says "not economically viable." Defense says this himself. He says something along the lines of like, "I'm not economically viable."
Yeah.
And I think that this is really critical and what makes this movie more interesting than other movies, because it does have this sort of like cross-race recognition that everyone has been failed by the American state.
Totally. Yeah.
The difference is that the cops come and get the black guy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The cops immediately get him.
And won't believe that a white, like even the black woman cop won't believe that a white guy did this. She's like, "Oh yeah, I'm sure a white guy did this." And it's like, it's kind of amazing that we have to go back to your point about the multicultural police force. It's kind of amazing that they're expressed in the film as still racist. they're still believing that a white male would never do this. This was obviously like Hispanic gangsters or something like that. And like that idea is an incredible one. And I think that gets us to the crowning scene, and the one that I think people think a lot about when they think about this movie is the scene at the Army surplus store, which, as you pointed out today on Twitter with the screenshot, and this is something I missed. I mean, there's fucking straight Marxism here. The name of the store is Surplus Value. And I'd actually love to know how intentional who was the person that like made the Nazi store be called Surplus Value and have that phrase all over it. Because what we find inside and what we get inside is this really, I think, brilliant, disturbing, fucked up scene that again is not perfect in the way that it's kind of communicating what it's trying to do. But at the same time, it's really I think the heart of the film in a lot of ways, because it touches on, here we are in the Nazi nest, and what happens in the scene is a defense goes into this Army Navy surplus store. and he encounters the owner of that store, who is played by an actor who is a well-known actor for a number of different reasons, but he's the guy that was for those of you that are Vietnam film people, he's the guy that was the mustache acid chef on the boat in Apocalypse Now, which I think is an interesting connection. Here he is, the actor is now this like skinhead Nazi. And you know what happens in this film, in this scene? There's a couple different things, right? What is the first thing that happens is there are only two other people in the store besides Defense, and it's a gay male couple, who the Nazi owner of the store, who we don't know is a Nazi yet, we just think he's a American reactionary type dude, is making really homophobic, shitty comments loudly at them to try to harass them out of the store. And they eventually do leave the store, and they leave Defense alone with this guy, and they end up having a very interesting interaction. What were the things that popped out to you? Because there's a lot in this scene.
So I think it's important to emphasize that the two gay characters are presented in a very stereotypical way. One of them's wearing a crop top. One of them's wearing like a tucked in pink t-shirt. And I can't imagine that was accidental, you know, especially given Joel Schumacher's own identity. So this is the first time in the movie that we actually hear like real racial slurs. The main character uses the N-word. Mm-hmm. He uses the F-word, like repeatedly. He uses the K word to refer to Jews. So this is by far the most like overtly racist scene in the movie. And what essentially happens is, over the course of this scene, the character, the store owner, whose name I don't think we ever know, tells Defense that he's on his side, that he's been listening to a police scanner. He heard sort of a description of the guy who's been going around terrorizing Los Angeles. And he basically says, like, I'm on your side. So much so that when Defense is sort of trying on some like combat boots, because throughout the movie, he actually has a hole in his shoe that's repeatedly referred to, you know, which is sort of the classic, like, declining, you know, tumbling down the class hierarchy symbol, a hole in the shoe. He's changing, he's getting on new shoes. And actually Robert Duvall's Latina cop character comes in, and she says, I'm looking for a guy of this description, of Defense's description. And the store owner actually says, I don't know what you're talking about. Never seen this guy. And Defense is actually in the changing room, and that the cop leaves. Robert Duvall's partner leaves, and the Nazi store owner tells Defense, like, I'm on your side, like I'm here to help you. So much so that he takes Defense to his like secret collection, which is essentially Nazi paraphernalia. There's a photo of Hitler, there's a bunch of swastikas, and he actually shows Defense a used canister of Zyklon B, and Zyklon B was the gas that was used at Auschwitz, you know, to gas, millions of Jews in the death camp of Auschwitz during World War II. And he actually, there's like little, there's a sound in it. I forget, there's something that makes a sound in it. And he goes, could you imagine how many K words this, and he uses the real word, of course, but I'm not going to use it even though I'm Jewish. He goes, could you imagine how many K words this thing killed? And eventually comes to the point where Defense is like, I'm not like you. Like, do you think we're on the same side? And the Nazi store owner is like, yeah, we're on the same side. And Defense is like, no, like, you're basically a piece of shit. I'm not on your side. And this is really important because I think it emphasizes here that Defense is not supposed to be a conservative. He's supposed to be a liberal, right? Sort of like a liberal dealing with the decline of the United States and the various dislocations of the post-Cold War period.
The line, so just to pause real quick, Danny, the line he says is, I'm an American and you're a sick asshole.
Right. So again, there's this pointing back, and I think, David, thank you so much. And I think that's critical because it's pointing back to sort of the founding moments of the American empire, right? Like, the United States was given the right to rule the world because they defeated the Nazis. You know, this sort of world historical evil, and this is what justifies the American empire. So here again, Defense is saying, like, I'm not like you, like, I'm American. We're good. Right, we do good in the world. You're evil, and this eventually, you know, the guy turns on him. He basically tries to put handcuffs on him, and Defense eventually kills him, first by stabbing him and then by shooting him several times. And this is, I think, the big moment in the film, because this is when Defense basically takes on his vigilante outfit of all black. right? He gets rid of the defense contractor's short sleeve shirts and tie and changes into the vigilante outfit that he'll wear for the entirety of the rest of the movie of all black. And I think this is really the critical moment because it's emphasizing defense's politics and also emphasizing sort of his turn to full vigilante. And it's very explicit because at some point in the scene where the Nazi tries to handcuff him, his glasses break. And once his glasses break, that's the movie signaling like this is the end. Like defense has become who he's fully become.
Yeah, and the posters and trailer and even the Newsweek cover in '93 featured the image of Michael Douglas with the broken glasses, and I think it actually parallels Straw Dogs because Dustin Hoffman on the cover of that movie. Dustin Hoffman, his glasses are broken, if I'm correct. So it's sort of there's something there, as a symbol.
David, just to briefly mention one thing, I think this is where Douglas's Jewishness is important, because the character definitely doesn't read as Jewish, like he's given a WASP name, but of course Douglas himself is Jewish, and also Dustin Hoffman is Jewish, right? So I think there's also some interesting things going on there. Who's considered white? I think it's interesting because like the Nazi is in some way sort of out of time himself because he's like anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is making a subtle argument that like one of the reasons that Douglas, does he actually say like I'm an American, you're a piece of shit? It's after the anti-Semitism comment, right?
And the N-words and all that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but he says the racism, the sort of anti-gay and anti-black stuff is said, but it's really only when he says the anti-Semitic stuff that Douglas turns, if I'm correct, right? And so I think that's a really interesting
moment.
And I think that.
And there's an interaction between. There's a great interaction between that character, that store owner, and the Latina officer who comes in and he says something like, "Hey, why don't you call them Officer S's because that's what a girl police officer should be called," and he's just kind of like being a dick, but in a sort of very like anti-identity politics way, if that makes sense. Like it's like very culture war 90s kind of antagonism that he's expressing of like, oh, do I have the right PC? Shouldn't you use, politically correct language or whatever? And you can sort of, it's almost like you get the sort of, the levels of his politics that he reveals. He'll reveal that layer of antagonism to that like Latina officer, but then he'll reveal even deeper layers of racism to the white guy because he feels he's safe.
Exactly, and I think that's exactly right. And again, it's just this racial imaginary is so confusing in the movie.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very easy to read it. Again, an aggrieved white man. I want to emphasize that reading isn't wrong, just because the racist elements are so muddled. But it again, it's so interesting. The sort of the reference to surplus value, as sort of like that. But this is where the Nazi is, right? So like it's unclear. I don't know. What do you think that means that they're using the Marxist term in this way to refer to a Nazi?
Well, I mean, part of it me was just thinking that they're invoking surplus value there with these two white guys in the store that both feel like they are surplus value, if that makes sense. Like they feel like they are like leftover or something, and that can go in a number of different directions. I don't know. That's one way I'm taking that. I felt like the film is playing with obsolescence. And obsolescence of human beings, and obsolescence of very particular human beings. This WASP figure that was sort of, given this sort of particular status in American life, and especially as through, expressed through the Cold War. Now, that surplus feels like it's like there's not room for that anymore, and that confusion is happening. Like, I mean, I read you that quote from the screenwriter, right? Like the screenwriter, I think this is like the screenwriter like of this film, and I'll get his name up here in a second. Like he's a guy that only wrote this film. Like this is like one of the only things that he did, and I'm looking for the quote that I sent you because I have it here somewhere.
Yeah, and David, as you look for that quote,
go ahead.
I just want to very briefly state what's interesting about this movie is that everyone is left behind.
Right,
There's
right.
no character.
And so, yeah, the guy's name is Ebro Smith, and here's his interpretation of what the movie's about. And, death of the author, who gives a fuck what this guy thinks? But I think that actually it does touch on a little bit of what we're talking about. The screenwriter says, to me, even though the movie deals with complicated urban issues, it really just is about one basic thing. The main character represents the old power structure of the United States that has now become archaic and hopelessly lost. And that way, I guess you could say defense is like Los Angeles. For both of them, it's a just or die time. There's a lot in that quote.
There's a ton in that quote. And this is what's so interesting. Los Angeles is then standing in for the United States as a whole, and I think that's not an accident.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I talked about it on this podcast. I actually don't think I have. But why I'm so fascinated by LA, why I love the city, is to me, it's by far the most imperial city of the post-1945 period. And let me just briefly explain why. First, it creates the weapons of the American empire, people like defense. Right. It also creates the ideas of the American empire at places like the Rand Corporation. And it also, of course, secondly, creates the culture of the American empire with Hollywood, which exports what it means to be an American, what it means to be a person, really, in the post-war system. And then third and finally, it also represents the hubris of American empire because it's a city built around cars in the 1940s and therefore built around the extraction of raw materials and fossil fuels, which at the time weren't mainly coming from the United States. So the city of Los Angeles is, in my opinion, able to really stand in synecdochically, I don't know if that's a right word, synecdochically, whatever, for the United States as a whole. And so I think that's a quote that really reveals a lot. And it really reveals, again, underlines the theme of the movie. It's sort of this post-imperial moment, and that what is a white guy or really anyone going to do in this moment.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's right. And we've been playing with that idea of LA as America, or LA as the center of the imperial project in the post-World War II period on this show through, the Davis book and through the Stephen J. Ross book about Hitler in Los Angeles. All of that stuff is I think connected to what you're describing here, which is that LA is a place that has a very particular role in the Cold War, and it also has a very particular role in sort of cultural imperialism too, right? Because of Hollywood, and it's sort of like the place where we're sort of like creating the structures of the Cold War at the same time we're sort of creating the ideological structures of the Cold War, if that makes sense. So that part of it, really comes out in the scene with the bazooka, because he has at some point defense. He acquires a bazooka that's at the army surplus store, I guess. And he wants to use it, and he wants to use it again, like I mentioned this before, but at the construction site. He's like pissed about traffic again. It's like full circle,
David.
Yeah.
Before we move on, this is very crucial. So he asks the guy, like, what are they fixing? And the guy's like, I don't know. And he's like, I know how it works. You have to spend the money this year, or you'll get your budget will be cut next year. Right? That's what the government wants you to do. So you're doing like basically make work nonsense. You're inconveniencing all these people in order to keep up your budget, which is a commentary on defense spending.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
yeah, totally. But it's also a kind of a conservative talking point, right? I mean, you hear that a lot, that like, it kind of like they're attacking wasteful government spending and jobs that are do nothing jobs.
Right. And no, it's a conservative talking point, but also true insofar as it relates to defense.
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah,
the
for sure.
Department,
For sure. So he wants to use this bazooka to fire at the construction site, basically. And he doesn't know how to use it. And a child, I think it's a young black child actually, shows him how to use it. And I thought, are they going to say like that this kid knows how to use this bazooka because he's like a gangster or something? But instead, what comes out in the scene is the defense asks him, hey kid, like, how do you know how to use this? And he says, oh, I saw it on TV. I saw it in movies, And so like right there's this sort of sense of like the direct connection between the military industrial complex and the dream machine of Hollywood, trickling into a child knowing how to use a bazooka. And there's a lot of like kind of generational humor they're kind of playing with in that scene. But I think that it definitely points to exactly what you're saying, which is like Los Angeles is the site of the sort of exporting of the vision of empire. At the same time, it's a site that is actually building the structures of empire.
Right. And I would also say is Los Angeles becomes like the model city of empire, right?
Mm-hmm.
A car-based city sort of exported around the world, particularly throughout the global south. And I think what's also really, and again, the sort of muddled racial politics of this movie is that when Michael Douglas mistakenly blows up the thing, like he wanted to blow it up, but he like mistakenly hits the trigger. He actually grabs the young black child and seeks to protect him.
Right.
Right. So this is also like, again, this like he's supposed to like generally be quote unquote a good guy, doing evil things. And I think like this is what's, again, the sort of muddled racial politics or confused racial politics of this movie.
Okay, so let's get through the end of this movie, because I want to get to it. I want to say a little bit about sort of how this connects to 2016 and the line, because I think that's part of what we were trying to get at, is this sort of idea that this film is recovering for us. When you watch this film in 2020, you're sort of seeing streams of political and cultural ideas that are very much active in the Trump era, right? And there, it seems like, as much as the mainstream media today likes to sort of think of this as a Trump phenomenon of the like angry mobs of white dudes, it seems like something that's been boiling in the culture for a lot longer, and Falling Down is sort of a lens on that, right? Like Falling Down is sort of and that's part of why it's muddled, I think, is in part because it's like, this is a phenomenon that we're starting to notice, that is starting to come together, I think, in really the late 80s and early 90s. In the Newsweek article, they actually kind of attach this white male paranoia to the Clinton administration. And they say, the reason why white men are so paranoid about losing their status in American life is because the Clinton administration is in office now, and they're the most ethnically diverse administration in American history, which is a really kind of incredible thing, because you're saying, like, that's what determines it. Like, this film Falling Down is not about who the president is. At the same time, it is sort of trying to intervene on, a phenomenon that is being noticed in the culture. But, there's this white male paranoia, anger, violence. It's like, isn't that the whole fucking history of the country? Like, isn't this what this white dude like has been around forever? This is just like the 1993 version of it, if that makes sense.
Oh, no, absolutely. So why don't you take us through the end, like what happens, and then we could talk about that, because I think the "I'm the bad guy" question mark.
Yeah, totally.
Really,
so just to fast forward a little bit, like what happens with is defense. This character Bill is on a journey, and and I think this is where you get sort of how sinister a character he is in some ways, because and maybe sinister is not the right word, but his journey is about trying to get back to his ex-wife and daughter before his daughter's birthday party, which is going to happen that afternoon. But they keep cutting back to his ex-wife, and you're learning that this guy might have been he's been harassing them. I think that's probably the best way of putting it, because she actually says he didn't.
This is important. He goes home. At some point, his wife escapes his home and he watches a home movie. And like the first half is him being nice, but like very quickly he like begins berating his wife. So like even in the good times, he was an asshole.
Right.
And I think that's an abuse. So I think, sorry, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. So he's got this, he's got anger issues, this guy.
Yeah.
And they're identifying that. And his wife is, she's played by Barbara Hershey. And she's, his wife is played as a terrified woman. She's literally like a scared person. And there's this weird scene where a male cop comes and interviews her and asks her about details of how defense has been to her and incidents that have happened in the past. And the cop is like really kind of antagonistic to her. He's like, "Did he ever hit you?" And she's like, "No, he didn't ever hit me, but I thought he was going to." And the cop is just kind of like, "Okay." And he's obviously, the cop like doesn't seem to think he even needs to be there. And I thought that was, I texted you for this last night because I'm sitting there watching this last night. I'm like, is this like a weird comment on carceral feminism? Like, is this some sort of weird intervention on the idea that women can use the police to go after their husbands and boyfriends, even if they're not guilty of anything? Because it seemed like the cop was kind of like making that comment. So setting that aside, and you can maybe say something about that. The end of this film is him getting to the house. Yeah.
I think this is important because this
Yeah.
movie is anti-cop. This movie is absolutely anti-cop.
That's right.
The
Yeah.
cops are presented as basically presented as venal assholes. Robert Duvall and his partner are the only good cops. And then importantly, I think they're particularly presented as venal assholes with regards Defense's wife, because like Guy you just said, but also at some point another, I believe, female cop comes by, and again she doesn't help Defense's ex-wife, and she's like, if you want to help, vote against defunding the police,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's like the advice given, like, so
She
there's
says if you
more
want to feel
patrol
safer,
cars.
next time they put something on the ballot that's going to cut police officers, vote no on that. And it's kind of incredible. Yeah, yeah. So I think you're right. I think that I read the scene that way then. In that the cops are all a bunch of fucking assholes. I mean, one of the main assholes in the movie is this like young like frat boy type cop in a suit that like is always he's almost like a cut rate Christian Bale. You know who I'm talking about? The guy that's always like making shitty comments at Robert Duvall and tells him like his wife's a piece of shit and everything.
So this is really critical, and like we probably don't have time to get into it, but Robert Duvall essentially becomes uncucked at the end. Throughout the movie, his wife is calling and yelling at him, but Robert Duvall's like, I'm going to continue to be a cop, and I'm going to go out and search for Defense. And then he does that. He figures out who he is, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually the wife gets in contact with Duvall, and Duvall basically yells at her and says, shut up, have my dinner ready, and keep the skin on my chicken for the cholesterol reasons. And his wife is like, okay, I'll do it. And then right after that, Robert Duvall punches this asshole Christian Bale as cop character in the face during his goodbye party, and the cop falls on his birthday. Interesting, because again, Robert Duvall becomes a masculine character when he embraces sort of the vigilante nature of a Defense. And I think that's, again, a confused message on feminism, where he actually tells the wife to shut up. And that's like, we're all supposed to cheer for that.
Yeah. And not only that, cheer for when he says like, make my dinner. In other words, he like basically puts her in that domestic housewife Cold War role, and says, that's what his victory is when he's able to put her there. So at the end of the film, the film ends on the Venice pier. And it's a scene that I think in a lot of ways I feel like I've seen that Venice boardwalk in so many fucking movies, and it like has a very Hollywood kind of charge to it. But he gets to his wife's house, he watches those home movies, and you get to know that this guy's a troubled guy in his marriage, and these troubles didn't start today. But at the same time, you then see like him basically run out onto the Venice pier, and where he finds his ex-wife and his daughter, and this is where the film kind of reaches its conclusion, and it all it's thinking about it now, I'm like, now who are the characters on that pier at the end? It's Defense and his ex-wife and his daughter and Robert Duvall, right? And so we're gonna like play out the differences and similarities and sort of kind of play with the tones of these characters, and the end of the sort of interaction and Defense's end is a kind of classic standoff between Robert Duvall holding a gun on Michael Douglas, and Michael Douglas basically saying, that he has a gun in his pocket and he commits suicide by cop, essentially. But before that happens, you get the sort of crowning scene in which you get to hear Michael Douglas say a little bit more, of what happened, and that's where you get the incredible line, and I think that kind of the line of the film, which is Michael Douglas asking, "I'm the bad guy." And there's something so heartbreaking about his delivery, because Duvall is holding a gun on him. There's cops everywhere. It's obvious that this chase has reached its end. And Douglas is kind of disbelieving. He can't understand that he's the quote unquote bad guy. And to me, I mean, there's so much resonance, and I'll let you say something about that right now. But I would just say that when I think of like good guys and bad guys, I think of that language sort of coming from the mid-century and coming from Hollywood, coming from ideas of sort of American black and white morality, the Cold War, etc. So for him to say I'm the bad guy is so tragic, because everything in the structure of society has been telling him he's the good guy. And the other thing that he says in this little diatribe is something like, I did everything I was supposed to do, and there's something really, I mean, as much as the film is muddled, there's something really tragic about the end of this movie.
No, absolutely. And what's so interesting, one of the things that really stuck out to me is when Douglas says, "I'm the bad guy," it's not like left, the answer is not left unsaid. I think Duvall says, like, "Yes, you're the bad guy,"
Yeah.
And I think that's what's also so interesting, because I think it's like doing a bunch of things. Like you said, sort of like, I actually did a Google Ngram, and the very terms good guys and bad guys only takes off in the mid 40s, right? So it's very much connected, sort of this by sort of like a Manichaean Cold War logic of
Yeah.
like good United States, bad everyone who is not United, who doesn't agree with the United States. And so I think it's a representative of that, but it's also like Michael Douglas is also the good guy, because like throughout the movie he never like sort of does something that one would like, that sort of outside moral norms besides the violence, right? He takes on gangbangers, quote unquote criminals. He defends consumer rights. He's like getting rid of like wasteful government spending. So like everything he did is like nominally good according to the sort of neolib culture of the 80s and the 90s. And even then he's left behind. And I think it's also representative of the sort of broader shift in whiteness and white culture, sort of recognizing the sort of fact that the United States, of course, was built on indigenous genocide, indigenous dispossession, slavery, westward expansion, and imperialism. And so it's also sort of recognizing at the end of the post-Cold War period that sort of this white American was actually the bad guy that did like a lot of damage to the world. But
Yeah.
again, interesting
Yeah.
is that this movie does not have good guys except Robert Duvall, and he's like kind of a cucked good guy for 95% of the movie, right? He's like someone who's like emasculated, who no one respects, who they don't even want him to do his job from the very first scene, who's kind of like a happy-go-lucky idiot. And so it's like an incredibly bleak scene with an incredibly bleak ending. And of course, it's important to emphasize that Michael Douglas, he says that it's like a quick draw scene. He's like, why don't we like quick draw? So it's harkening back to sort of the Western and spaghetti Westerns of the 50s and the 60s, is sort of American or pseudo-American genre. And he doesn't actually have a gun. He only has a water gun, right? So he draws the water gun and he's shot and he falls over the Venice Pier, and he dies. And I think the movie is basically leaving you with the question, like, who is the good guy? Who is the bad guy? And I think its answer is there are no good guys and there are no bad guys. And we're just like in a nation without a purpose. That was having seen it from the vantage point of 2020. That is absolutely what I took away from it. And then the movie sort of ends with like kind of a nothing scene. It's Michael Douglas's daughter's birthday party, and it kind of just like ends there. And they're like, don't. Robert Duvall says to Michael Douglas's ex-wife, "Don't tell your daughter that her dad died. Tell her tomorrow. Let her enjoy her party." And it's actually implied that Robert Duvall is not going to retire. He said like his name's going to be in quote unquote mud when his wife finds out that he's going to remain a cop, although that's a little bit unclear. And that's how the movie ends. So I think it's like leaving us with the question of like, who is the bad guy? Who is the good guy? It's very much unclear.
Yeah, for sure. But also, I don't know. I mean, Duvall at some point says, you are coming here to kill your wife and kid. That's what you came here for. And, do you think that's true? Do you think within the text of the film we're to believe that Defense was going to kill his wife and kid? Because I mean, there's something he says to her on the phone right before he comes and sees her. He says something like, in other countries it's legal to kill your wife if she insults you. And so he literally does seem like he's going to enact some violence. And if this were a real story, I would think that this guy who's journeying through the city doing violence to all sorts of people, all on the way to his ex-wife's house, I would think that he is gonna kill his ex-wife. So that part of it is kind of weird, because it's like it's left, and I think it fits into what you're saying, which is that we don't really know, at the end, and even if he did kill his wife, I think this film is not about this guy being a good or bad guy so much about kind of understanding, how these things work and how these things are products of larger forces.
Yeah, I think that's right. My guess is that he would have killed them. Yeah. I mean, I think it's that he's like going ever off the deep end. But what's also interesting is that like I think the movie does emphasize the structural issues, but it does take pains at times to sort of underline that this is also Michael Douglas, or Defense is the individual, right? Like the video that I mentioned, the home video of him being an asshole before he was fired, but also they visit Defense's wife, mother, and she's like, I think he's a psychopath. And I think he's going to kill me. So I think it's an interesting sort of juxtaposition where it's both structure schedule, but I think it does emphasize the structure. But yeah, I think he was going to kill them. I think that that's definitely implied.
The film could have been way darker,
by
actually.
the entire movie.
The film could have been like, I mean, I was thinking about Joker. I was thinking about Taxi Driver. I do think Taxi Driver, I mean, all these are different films, and they're all investigating something slightly different, but they all sort of make nods at the kind of political economy in different ways. It is a phenomenon, but it's also like kind of interesting to look at this Newsweek article in '93, in which they're sort of placing it within the cultural politics of the Clinton era. You know, like I think people that are maybe younger don't know sort of what the early Clinton years were like. They were sort of similar to the Obama years in the sense that there was like a sort of jubilation about the end of the Reagan years and a jubilation of like a new, diverse, gay-friendly sort of, even though Clinton was like, you know, Defense of Marriage Act and all that sort of stuff, Clinton was associated with a sort of kind of cultural moment. But it was also kind of, it's interesting because people were associating that cultural moment with like white male decline. And I just want to read this quick, stupid set of quotes from the Newsweek article in which they basically, you know, it to me, it's kind of chilling to read this because this is 1993. The cover story of the Newsweek magazine is falling down. It has the picture of Michael Douglas's face, and it says "white male paranoia" is the image. And the article itself is crazy. It goes into like all the it's kind of investigating why are white men feeling so put upon these days. And it's interesting because it does touch on a lot of the things we're talking about, but a lot of it is through the lens of race and culture. And there's this unbelievable quote that I'll read right now. It says, in its terminal stages, white male paranoia turns apocalyptic. Look at our TV sitcom, says Jerry Boyer, editor of Pittsburgh's 126-year-old Christian Statesman, which he says is America's oldest conservative Christian publication. Quote, the white male, the dad, is always the stupidest guy in the room. A culture that's constantly denigrating its own authority structure, whether it's white males in this culture or black females in a matriarchal African culture, is not going to last. Larry Evans, 45, a liberal activist from Pittsburgh, is also thinking gloomy global thoughts. Quote, the paranoia the typical white guy has is deep-rooted, he says. Western Europeans are not exactly populating the earth right now, and in the 21st century, that's going to be even more apparent. It's going to end up in a confrontation. He adds, here I am sounding like a Nazi. So that's in 93. What do you make of that? I mean, there's something going on in the culture that's not Trump in 93, in other words, even though Trump was alive.
It's funny, like growing up in Trump was like this very much a local figure. It's wild to see him be this international figure. But anyway, for another time. I think that this is related to sort of the clash of civilizations rhetoric as exemplified by someone like Samuel Huntington. And again, I think the crucial thing is just sort of what do you do when the reason for being, the raison d'être of like an entire state is taken away in a flash. And like you didn't even quite really win the battle with the Soviet Union, you just like kind of didn't lose it. And I think this is all about grasping for a reason for being. And that this is why something like Huntington's Clash of Civilizations becomes so popular. And this is why I think Schumacher, or the screenwriter, made Defense a defense worker, right? I think it's just underlying this sort of adrift nature of this empire without a reason, this organization man without an organization. That like from today's perspective, we could see was very quickly resolved, at least in some ways, by providing a new logic for the American empire with, again, preventing genocide in Islam. And today they're trying to do with the new Cold War in China. But I think back then was very much an open question. It's really in this interregnum moment between 1989 and 1995, you know, post LA riots, post Cold War, where people don't know what sort of the future of the United States, aka the future of the white man, is going to be, and that you even have someone who's a quote unquote liberal sounding like a Nazi, because the assumption is that, you know, the United States will protect and defend the world, and that assumption is no longer held when there's literally no enemy, right? There's no enemy, so who are the enemies? Gangbangers, you know, people giving you your consumption directly when you need it, a state that no longer needs you, a society that no longer needs you. And that's all reflected in falling down. And that's why I think it's lasted for so long.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a cliche to say these sort of things, but it is prophetic. You know, it is prophetic of a certain sort of white male ideology that I think has grown in sort of public culture since the Trump era. At the same time, it's you know, this is '93, and it's picking up on things that are, you know, the specific shape of this resentment, but something that's been there for a long time. It makes me wonder, what Trump would think of this movie. I feel like he would be a dumbass fan of this movie in the '90s. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like he's got a little bit of a vigilante kind of shit in him in the way he constructs violence. I'd love to, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if the fucking guy tweeted about this movie at some point. But either way, it does seem like, as much as we're sitting here saying, you know, defense is a liberal and sort of kind of coming to the end of this particular historical moment, it's also falling down is a weirdly can serve as red meat for fascists, which is kind of strange. I mean, considering the Nazi scene and everything like that. But at the same time, I mean, people read things all sorts of ways, and this vigilante figure is one that I feel like is still very much operative in American life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you see it by the popularity of something like Joker, right? There's clearly a hunger amongst people for this sort of masculine, violent release,
Right.
Sort of getting back at the people who are enemies. And we didn't really talk about it, and clearly there's not enough time now, but it's also, this movie is a story about baby boomers, right? If Defense is in his 30s, let's say he's 38 in 1992 when the movie was filmed, that means he was born in the mid 1950s, right? This sort of the mid to late period of the baby boom. And so this is like, in some sense, it's a commentary on the baby boomers that are adrift right at this particular moment. And I think that's really important, because it's also important to recognize that Defense probably wouldn't be a Trump voter. I mean, at least in his non-insane, you know, he's like a professional middle-class worker from Los Angeles.
If he didn't
right?
die, though, and he was still alive and he was like 70 something now, he probably would be a Trump voter.
Yes, exactly. He would be. Exactly. Now he would be. And that's what I wanted to emphasize, is that it's a story of sort of about the deliberalification, or sort of the conservatification of the baby boom generation. You know, like, could you imagine what a Defense
I'm sorry, dude.
News?
Yeah, it's not Californication, it's conservatification, whatever that word is. Yeah, totally.
It's Californication and conservatification. I mean, Defense news viewer is definitely a Trump voter, you know. So I think it's also part about the sort of the demystification of the baby boom generation. Just like, what does a baby boom generation do without sort of their childhood fantasies?
Yeah.
And the answer is they become right wing.
Oh my god. And dude, this movie, this is like a two-parter, because I mean, there's like there's scenes with Class where, like, you know, he climbs into the fucking golf club, and the scene in the country club against like these like old, like rich elite white men, and he's contrasted with them. I mean, these men even say he doesn't belong here. There's the scene where he climbs the wall of a really rich mansion and ends up in the backyard with a family that are actually the caretakers of the home, and the home is you find out the actual person who owns the home is a plastic surgeon. And Defense, I think, makes a comment something along the lines of, like, you know, it's the plastic surgeons who are the ones that have these homes, you know, and like that idea of class comes back a lot. You see Defense as someone who's his alienation and his frustration is aimed in all directions, because he's really like a man without an organization. I think you're right. I love the idea of, like, this is a film about the white male sort of being laundered out of the liberal project and being shot into a reactionary world. And in that sense, I think you can draw a straight line from the tensions that are described in Falling Down, played with in, you know, admittedly muddled ways, but a straight line from the politics there to the politics of the Trump era, in which that phenomenon has only accelerated, and that kind of pitching of, like, the deliberalification of the white male and the pitching him into a reactionary fantasy land, that seems like a really, really forward thinking film in many ways, as much as it is a kind of frustrating one at the same time.
And I think that's right. And I think one could read the quote unquote hero's journey of the film as being that.
Yeah.
As being like Defense eventually winding up as someone who's committing suicide by cop dressed in all black on the Venice Pier. Ugh. Sort of this hyper reactionary image. from someone who started out in their car and just frustrated with the little indignities of life. And I think that's kind of the story of the entire film and why it has such resonance still today.
Fucking A. We got through it, man. It does make me think of Taxi Driver because it's the same journey in a lot of ways. You're in a car in Taxi Driver at the beginning, and he's kind of got it together, but by the end, he is the full reactionary vigilante, and that it seems like that is a hero's journey that we imagine, or at least Hollywood imagines, again and again and again. And Falling Down in '93 is a really, really compelling kind of take on it. One that is a film that I think would be taken differently by different kinds of audiences. I wonder what my hyper woke 19-year-old college students would think about it. I wonder what MAGA people think about this film. I don't think the film really belongs in any particular political category. Although I do agree that with your initial statement that it is solidly sort of within the liberal sort of milieu of takes on these issues. But at the same time, I urge everyone to go check out Falling Down and see what you think of it, because it is an important film, and it is sort of, I think, important because of how much it indicates how these trends are still very much operative in our culture in just a different moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just as we wrap up, I just want to say, people who have kept with us to the end, David and I are thinking about doing an LA movie series. And if people would be interested about that, just to let us know. And if there's interest, we'll definitely do it, because I think we're both fascinated with the history of LA and Southern California and what it says about sort of the American imperial project. So yeah, this was really fun, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, everyone out there, hit us up, because there are a lot of movies that I know I want to talk about, but I think there are probably others that we might not be on our radar that we'd love to take a look at, because I do think we're onto something important in terms of kind of locating Los Angeles and Hollywood as a very particular sort of expression of this politics. Thank you, Danny. We'll catch up with you again very soon, as always.
Thanks, David. Talk to you soon. Bye.
All right, huge thank you to Danny Bessner for walking through Falling Down with me. It's a film that, again, has so much going on, and I thank you for sticking through to the end if you're still with us. And thanks for all the people that are supporting the show. If you want more of our conversations, we put up a really, I think honestly, I say this a lot, but honestly, one of the greatest conversations I've had with Justin Rogers Cooper just a couple weeks ago. It's called Lust for the Boot, and it's about Nazis in Los Angeles. Go check that out on our Patreon if you are not a subscriber already. And like I said, we've got lots more episodes with Danny Bessner coming about movies in Los Angeles, particularly in the 90s. So lots of cool stuff coming for those that are subscribers. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap is where you do that. And thanks, Danny, for being such a great contributor to the show. And we'll see you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.